Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm really sorry to trouble you, but would you mind awfully if we made a start on this session on politeness? And so I might go on in similar vein if I was going to do an exaggerated form of politeness, but I won't. But welcome to this York Festival of Events session on politeness. I'm Colin Philpott, I'm chairing it. I've been associated with this festival since it started. You don't need to know about me, but briefly, I'm an author. I used to work for the BBC, and I was the director of the National Science and Media Museum. It's now called in Bradford, so that's my background. And it's my great pleasure to welcome Louise Mullany, who has written this book. Now, it's a very good book, but one of the great things about it, in my opinion, is the title. It absolutely tells you what it's about. Some books have far too clever titles, don't they? But this is very straightforward. It's about politeness. Louise is the Professor of Sociolinguistics at the University of Nottingham, and she's taught the science of politeness for 25 years. But as well as lecturing and research at the university, she's also been involved as a consultant with lots of businesses, public sector organisations, charities and other bodies on communication skills, including, of course, how to be polite. There will, of course, be an opportunity later for your questions, as long as they're polite. But first, please give a warm York welcome to Louise Mullany. Now, the question I've got to ask you first is, how did you get into all this? I mean, presumably when people say to you, what do? You say, I study politeness. They go, so, really?
What's that all about? It was when I was an undergraduate student and I did a module called Sociolinguistics, Language and Society. And we had a session on politeness, and suddenly everything just fitted into place. Everything that I'd thought about in terms of how we interact with each other, the book and what I was taught and the science of politeness really makes things make sense. And the first chapter is called Politeness Everywhere. So it's not just thinking about manners and civility, it's actually thinking about how we communicate all of the time with all of the people that we come into contact with. And learning that there was a science behind this and that people had studied it and come up with models and explanations and really interesting ways of thinking about it, and that it actually had a system, made me think about language in a completely different way. And I know it sounds cliche, but I didn't look at the world in the same way again. I was always thinking, what's happening here? And when the boundaries of politeness are broken and impoliteness happens, that's when we really notice what politeness is and what it does. And then you start to think about, so what do I do next? Or how do I explain this? Or how do I come up with a way of rectifying this situation if miscommunication or conflict has happened? And these models have looked at all of these different elements that we were taught as undergraduates. And then the field has kind of grown since there. And I think I did an undergraduate dissertation on it and then never looked back, really. It's been part of my research from that moment moving forwards.
One thing I think the book achieves rather well is it at one and the same time an academic study of what you've just described, really. But it's also a sort of manual book in a way, isn't it? It's a sort of, it's not exactly how to be polite, but it does, you quite unashamedly sort of give some advice, really, on how to deal with different situations where one's politeness might be tested, for example.
And we wanted it to be, myself and the publishers wanted it to be something that people could use. So there's lots of kind of toolkits in there. So how to think about giving the best apology, or when apologies fail, or when you've encountered somebody that's been really, really rude to you. And I think we could probably all remember those instances where somebody's been really rude and it really bothers us. And we play the conversation out in our heads over and over again and do that, oh, I wish I'd said this, or I wish I'd said that. And that's when we can see those boundaries of politeness. That's when we know that the polite behaviour has been broken and that the norms of what we expect have been broken. And it can be things like not holding the door open for somebody. It can be things like bumping into each other on the street. And we have that really quirky British thing where we both say sorry to each other, even though it's probably not our fault. But if the other person doesn't say sorry, then we get quite upset about it. So that's where those kind of boundaries are in place.
Interesting, you said quirky British thing, so we'll come on to that later about the different views of politeness in different cultures, which is obviously a big part of this subject. We'll come on to that. So this is probably the most difficult question I'm going to ask you, but in the style of election debates, we'll come on to the election of politeness in a minute as well. In 45 seconds, define politeness.
It's about cooperation, it's about harmony, it's about how we manage rapport with one another, how we strengthen friendships, how we strengthen, say, our work teams, the people that we work with, basically how we maintain good relationships with one another and how we go about our daily lives maintaining good relationships with one another. Is that on 45?
Probably less than 45. Okay, so it's, I suppose people often, when I was thinking about that, politeness, I was thinking really about spoken, that, you know, what you say, but of course it's more than that, it's much more than that, isn't it?
It's far, far more than that. And if we think about written communication, so think about letters that we receive, think about the formality of letters that you get, dear, Mr, Mrs, Doctor, you know, those titles that are there that are much more formal. Politeness is everywhere in that communication as well. So there's big studies that have been conducted on all kinds of letters that we get from utility firms, say from hospitals, how are we addressed, what kind of language is used. Written communication tends to be more formal in its politeness, but it all depends on context. It depends where we are and who we're talking to, what we're talking about, what context we're in. So we will talk very differently if we're in a setting like this, in a lecture, than we will at home with our family and friends. But politeness is still there and we still have norms. So it shifts and it drifts the type of politeness that we use. If we think about, say, our home lives, what pet names do you have for each other? What names do you have that only you would call your children or parents or other relatives that other people, if they hear them, go, oh, that's a bit strange. But we all have those kind of names to signal our relationship, and that's part of what the academics call positive politeness, the way that we positively identify with one another and signal our relationships through things like terms of address to show our intimacy with other people, or it could be showing social bonds or solidarity. Say, for example, with sports teams, there might be particular chants or names that are just used in that context. So if you just think about your own lives, think about what names you're called, think about the context where those names shift and drift. It's all telling you information about what your relationship is like with other people, and what politeness that conveys can tell you a huge amount about your relationship with them.
One thing you talk about in the book, which I'd never thought about before, is the difference between positive and negative politeness. Just explain that.
So this is these are probably a couple of just academic terms that I've just peppered into the book. Negative politeness doesn't mean anything that's negative or anything that's bad. It actually means that you, again, just to give the British example, polite-wise, we don't like imposing on other people. And when we have to, say, for example, borrow somebody's car or ask for a favour, ask for somebody to help you with your luggage, you don't really want to impose on them, so you will use different politeness strategies in that case, and that's called negative politeness. It attends to that desire and want that we all have to not be imposed upon and to not have our wishes imposed on. And when we want to get somebody else to do something for us, we might say things like, oh, I'm extremely sorry to bother you, would you mind just giving me a hand with this? And again, culturally, that can be really different. And from a British perspective, people from other cultures will find it too much. Why are you saying all these things? I don't need this. Just ask me to pass you the suitcase, So that idea versus negative politeness and indirectness is very, very clear. Positive politeness, the opposite, is when we want to show our solidarity and our friendship with other people. And that's where we do use things like giving each other compliments, saying, oh, lovely dress, that's a really nice shirt. You pay attention to what's called their positive face. So really show that you've got a strong bond with people, taking an interest in people's lives, asking about, how's the family, that kind of thing that we do when we haven't seen each other for a while. If you're at work and you go into the workplace on a Monday, how much do you talk to each other about what did you do over the weekend? That's all positive politeness. It's showing that you've got a strong relationship with other people, and ultimately that you care about one another and that you've got empathy with the people that you work with.
Cynics might say, you've made a career out of making this an academic subject, and other people have as well. Mm-hmm. In the end, is it anything more than just being nice to other people, which may be for a mixture of motives. People are nice to people genuinely, altruistically, or because it's in their self-interest to be nice to other people. But is it actually more complicated than that in the end?
It's far more complicated than that, and I think one of the discussions we had about the title was whether or not the book should be called Impolite. Right. Because I talk a lot about when the boundaries are crossed and when people are impolite to one another, what happens then? What do you do? And that's very, very complex to unpick. And people started researching this in the 1960s, and about 30 years later they went, we haven't actually looked at impoliteness, and impoliteness is actually really significant. So there was a sense that only one side of a very complex picture had been looked at, and when impoliteness was looked at, that was the point where things like coming up with ways of rectifying or coming to a resolution with miscommunication and conflict really started to take off. And that's, I think, probably one of the most interesting areas for me, personally speaking, particularly with the consultancy work that me and my team do. We often go into businesses when there's been a problem, when there's been trouble, people have fallen out. How do you mend those relationships? What can you do in those kind of situations?
Is politeness a middle class thing?
This is a really interesting question, and it's one that I talk about right at the very beginning. The norms that we have and our expectations that we have in the UK, again, are established by middle class norms. And our expectations about civility and manners and morals are informed by middle class norms. But once you look into it, everybody has politeness in every group, across different social classes, particularly if we're thinking about positive politeness. It looks different for all of us. It looks different depending on what age we are. Social class background is obviously really important. Gender is another area where there can be a lot of different ways in which things are expressed or different expectations. So class is one area, it's one kind of variable that we have out there. But again, it's more complex than that. But a lot of standards, shall we say, are middle class and has been inherited historically.
So the way people might express their politeness or indeed their impoliteness might differ because of their social class, or their age, or indeed their cultural differences, which will come into different countries. But it's there for everybody.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
What about the relationship which you talk about, between politeness and power? So do the powerful determine sort of what's polite and what isn't?
Yeah, definitely. And again, that cuts across a whole range of aspects. So if we think of things like courtrooms, for example, there's a very particular scripted way in which the most powerful people get to speak first, that they dictate who speaks next. Think about the House of Commons, it's got its own structures, it's got its own way of communicating. So in those contexts, people are given a lot of power if they also have status. Power is there all the time, and how we use politeness will depend upon our power relationships with one another. So if we're very close, we're very intimate with people, we know them really well, so friends, partners, people that we experience our lives with, then the power differential will be very, very small, and we'll use more of the positive politeness strategies. At the other end, if we're in formal contexts, whether it be a job interview, whether it's students at a university talking to their lecturing staff, the power differentials are huge, and that affects every aspect of how we communicate with that person, right from titles and greetings through to how we talk to them in terms of asking questions, that kind of thing.
Let's talk a bit about the differences in perceptions of politeness in different parts of the world, different countries. I mean, we were talking before, weren't we? I think I'm right in saying that it's considered very rude in Japan to blow your nose in public, whereas I don't think people would think that. And so, broadly, what are the sorts of different? Give some examples of some of the differences in different parts of the world and why they exist.
The example of the sneezing is a really interesting one. Pre-COVID, it was incredibly rude to have a handkerchief, and you think how important handkerchiefs are in Britain. So that's just kind of one very small example. There's a lot of research that's being done, particularly in Japan and China, and looking at different ways in which Western politeness just doesn't play out in different countries, particularly China and Japan, where things are very, very much more formal. Politeness is much more obvious in cultural interactions, and politeness is cliche again. Politeness is everywhere for all of us, but it looks very different, and there tends to be an emphasis on groups and group dynamics in, say, Japanese society, and politeness is very much attending to other people's face, checking sure that other people are okay, whereas in Britain and the US, for example, it's more individualistic, so it's seen in that way.
But even within countries in which you might describe as broadly similar, say, Western liberal democracies, there are differences, aren't there? I mean, people in many other Western European countries are much more direct.
Yeah, exactly.
Like asking for a drink, somebody a Brit will tend to say, could I have a, in a rather sort of diffident way, whereas I had to have one of my daughter's partners is Spanish, and he'll go up to a bar and ask for a drink, about 2 beers, and it's not, he doesn't consider that, it sounds rude to me, but So how have those differences developed? You know, in countries which this is not about, you know, the West against Oriental countries. It's just about countries that are actually quite similar in lots of ways. Yeah.
And politeness is there. It just, as you say, it just manifests itself very differently, and our expectations are very different in those spaces. So directness and indirectness is probably one of the really key areas where we will notice it, particularly if we're travelling around, you know, around Europe or anywhere else in the world. You will notice those differences if you're multilingual, speak different languages, and if you're learning different languages as well, you will realise quite quickly that you need to ask things in a very different way. But we still have our norms from where, our original norms from where we first learned languages. So you've still got that, oh, actually, I need to do that differently now. I need to come up with this. And it's just different ways in which different cultures have developed and different ways in which, thinking about different countries, again, it's about social class. You know, who was the most powerful? What language styles became the norm and became associated with the most power, and that then grows these norms that we all have for politeness, depending upon where we are, what different languages we speak.
But this sort of, you know, indirect round the houses way that seems to be a sort of British thing that I sort of exaggerated at the beginning. I mean, is it a particularly British thing, or will you find that, you know, rather than just saying, pass me the water, would you mind awfully passing me the water? I mean, that sort of thing, is that a particularly British thing, or would you find that in other
You do get it elsewhere, depending upon the relationship between people. So it depends on who you're talking to, where you are, what that situation is. That all dictates those different norms and what we would expect in that space.
And of course, again, I think I haven't really thought about, but in some languages you have different words, don't you? So, for example, in French, the tu veux is an example, and that exists in some other languages of a formal and informal word for the same thing.
Which we used to have in British English, but it died out, so you still have it in a few dialects. It's a really interesting one, that, because a lot of the material that's been written by linguists says as English speakers we're actually really fortunate because we don't have to encode everything in this very obvious way, and if you get your tu and vu wrong, the consequences can be really significant.
If you say tu to somebody who
it's really
like a family member or close friend, it can be regarded as very sort of forward, can't it?
And just really, really inappropriate that you've got those norms wrong. So it's something that we are looking with, and it's the same in English as well. We don't always have to use terms of address, so we don't have to use senor, senorita, and we can avoid, you know, using those terms by having that kind of just avoidance of term of address. So I think we all do this quite a lot. If you're not quite sure what to call somebody, and I can remember, like historically, you know, kind of going to meet boyfriend's family, and I don't know what to call them. Do you call them Mrs, Mr, whatever? And you just kind of like go hi and don't use a name at all. And then eventually you get to a point where you have to use a name, and you know how formal you should be in those contexts. I think is something that is shifting around as well.
That's interesting. We've just had two grandchildren under the age of 4. They stayed with us for a week, and they're just getting to the age, or particularly the older one, of realising that, you know, adults have names as well as granddad or whatnot, and they like you their sort of their understanding, the identity thing, which is quite interesting.
That's good.
In the book, you give a really good example about differences between different cultures. About I think it's a Chinese business delegation visiting Britain. And misunderstanding. Just briefly, it's a good example.
It's a nice example. This is from a colleague of mine from Warwick University, and she was looking at what happens in terms of space as well. So not just the language that you're using, but where people sit, where they position themselves, and what that tells you about politeness and power. So it's not just about the language we use. Obviously, it's about our gestures. I always go dramatic with gestures whenever I do this. So it's not just about the language. In the room where the meeting was being held, what happened was a Chinese delegation was coming over to visit a British company. The seating plan meant that the Chinese business delegation sat down the side, and the British company, the chair of the British company, sat at the head of the table. So it was non-reciprocal, and the Chinese leader got really, really offended and said, you know, basically, this is afterwards, because what the linguists did was took them to one side and said, what happened? That meeting was, you know, what happened? What went wrong? That was the first thing that happened, was that they weren't both head of the table. Sitting down the side also, it implied that they weren't really important. The next thing that happened was that the chair, the business from the British business, got up and he spoke and he welcomed people. Didn't give the Chinese delegate, the head of the company, the conversational floor. The British company thought this was a positive thing because, oh, you don't have to plan a speech. So we thought you probably wouldn't need to plan a speech or wouldn't want to plan a speech, but never offered that opportunity. So there were all these things going on. The translator then didn't help matters because the chair had said, would you like to introduce your colleagues? Would you like to introduce us to people? And the Chinese leader went, well, not really, no, because I want to get up and say something. So he started his speech. The translator then cut him off and went, no, that's not what you've been asked to do. You've been asked to introduce your colleagues, your clients. So things were getting more and more heated. So that was what he then did. And the meeting just broke down. They were there to negotiate new business. And the Chinese delegation had thought that the British company was in financial deficit. And they thought that they were rescuing them. And the British company very firmly denied this. And in the end, they said, well, we've rescued you. Why aren't you showing us some deference? Why aren't you showing us some respect? This is awful. And the British delegation were absolutely horrified that had happened and they'd done that. And so much of it was subconscious. They also didn't have the right people in the room. So at a previous delegation meeting from other people that had come over from the Chinese company, everything had gone brilliantly, they all got on really well. But that was partly because they had a business development manager in the room who'd been to China and could talk to them, make them feel at home. They didn't have any of this. So it was a very unfortunate set of circumstances which were then unpicked, and everybody was horrified, but learned a lot from having it analysed afterwards, and that was one way in which they kind of tried to mend the relationship as a consequence of that.
And the difference in views about whether certain aspects of body language, if you like, are polite or impolite, like bodily noises of one sort or another. Yeah. I mean, in some cultures, some bodily noises are expected, others to show appreciation for a meal. Yeah. In others, it will be considered quite rude to burp in public or whatever. Yeah. I mean, how's all that developed, do you think?
There's a huge amount of information out there in terms of that, and I think there's a couple of examples in the book of when people go to a different culture. There's an example of somebody from the UK who's visiting a New Zealand family and was told to bring a plate. And she took a physical plate, where she was supposed to actually bring some food and arrive with this plate and went, oh, okay, that's a bit weird, really sorry, didn't quite understand what you were looking for then, which was really quite humorous. And I think HSBC, I don't know if you remember this, they had a really big advertising campaign that ran for quite a few years, where they were the world's local bank, so they had that local cultural knowledge. And there's an example in there, which is a lovely example of a British business person who's been taken out for dinner, didn't realise that you're supposed to leave food on your plate as a sign of politeness. He kept finishing his plate because he thought that was what was expected, and they kept bringing out these eels, and they got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And this guy in the end has to run off to the bathroom and be sick. And it's like that message, HSBC message, it pays to have local knowledge, it pays to know what that etiquette is in terms of eating and when you stop eating and what you do around those occasions.
Near the beginning of the book, you talk about wanting to question or maybe explode even 3 particular myths around politeness. The first of which is probably the generally held view that somehow women are more polite than men. So definitely. You don't think that's true then?
So the linguistic evidence says no. There are stereotypes that women are more polite than men, but there are also social expectations that women need to be more polite than men, and that's the thing. That's the area that really needs to be focused on. So there's quite a famous quotation. It's not gender difference, but the difference that gender makes, and how we evaluate and judge one another on the grounds of what we expect. So a lot of the evidence, say for example in the workplace where I've done a lot of research, shows that men and women speak very similarly when they're occupying roles such as business leaders or they're chairing meetings. But if women don't apologise for certain things, then that's stigmatised and that's held out. So the expectations, that idea of being more ladylike or needing to really use your language in a very strategic way that aligns more with middle class politeness norms is something that has been found. And if you don't, the stigmatisation is, you're not.
So women are judged more harshly than men?
Yes. Yeah.
So that's what you're saying. Okay. And I suppose also there's probably a general view that somehow young people are less polite than older people.
And I think that's quite...
Is that true?
That's quite...
Isn't it?
The language that they use is different, so it's not that they are more impolite or that politeness standards are declining with young people. Young people are language innovators, and what you do when you go through adolescence is, as young people, strive for identities and strive for ways of making yourself different from the generation that's come before. And language is obviously one of the key ways of doing that. It's very, very important for peer group solidarity. It's something that adolescents will do when they get to a certain age to signal that difference from parents, difference from teachers. So you get lots of innovation coming into language at that particular point. So their politeness norms might be different. They'll come up with different informal terms for one another. They'll look at things differently. But right from the very start of people being interested in politeness, which goes back 1,000 years, there has been constant debate that politeness standards are declining, that politeness is, everybody's becoming rude. That's been going on for 1,000 years. That everybody has thought that. So it's obviously a myth, it's not true. It's a generational difference, and people use, they'll use politeness in different ways for different purposes.
The whole business about how we teach politeness to small children is fascinating. I mean, again, sorry, give my example, having grandchildren with me recently, it's fresh in my mind, is the business about, getting them to say please and thank you. And I know the mother of my grandchildren is strongly of the view, don't, when they're only like 1 and 2 and they're only just starting to speak, it's not the most important thing. I mean, obviously you want to say please and thank you, but now that one of them's 3.5, and there were certain occasions when I'm instinctively thinking, I should be saying to her, you should say please. Well, then you think, well, is that necessary, or will that just come anyway? Because they will hear people saying please and thank you around them, and it's just they just pick it up. They pick up other things. Or do you think it's something that young children, have to be taught politeness in that way, in a sort of formal way almost?
I mean, it kind of happens. It happens naturally, and a lot of linguistic studies have focused on small children around the age of 2, when we start to do this with children. So they're probably around the age that your grandchild is now. That constant say please, say thank you, say excuse me is there across all social class groupings. People are aware of the fact that you need to be polite and that the children need to exist in this world, and it just comes as a kind of process that we do. So partly because it's important to teach children to have those social norms, to know what those social norms are, so that they can interact once they go into school, once they go into different fields. Interestingly, a lot of the research is carried out with middle class families, and a lot of the early research was in the States, but then it's been the same similar patterns that have been found. And there's a really nice example from one of my friends from a few years ago, when our children were small. She'd said to her son, he said, "Mummy, I want some milk." And she said, "Say the magic word." And he said abracadabra. Did what he was asked. No, please, you've got to say please. So, and the research shows how that then snowballs, and once you get to kind of 10, at that age, children understand what politeness is. When we're talking to 2-year-olds about politeness, they've got no clue, they've got no concept what it is or why it's important. They just know that people are constantly telling them to, say please, say thank you. Get to about 10 and then their competence tends to grow, and they can see the importance of it and really learn what linguists call pragmatic competence. So you become competent in your language awareness and how it affects your relationships with other people. And then that goes on through, there's quite a lot of studies that look at family dinner tables and dinner table talk, and about how adolescents get older, they get more of the conversational floor at dinner time, and they learn what topics are appropriate and what topics aren't appropriate depending upon which family members are present. So what topics can you talk on in front of your grandparents? What topics must you never mention in front of, certain family members? What are those family secrets which must never come out? And it's all about a lot of the time it's about politeness and etiquette and what topics are acceptable.
The third myth that you say you want to explode is that swearing is always bad.
There are some contexts where swearing is really good, and there are contexts where it establishes solidarity amongst groups. So think for example of a sports team. I don't know if any of you have watched the kind of fly on the wall documentaries of football clubs, rugby clubs, that kind of thing. They swear all the time, and they do it to add value, to get those bonds really strongly with each other, to get that sense of camaraderie, and it's an accepted part of their speech patterns, of their speech norms, of how they show solidarity to one another. Research has been done on building sites, very, very common as a way of not insulting one another, but a way of showing solidarity with those particular groups. And also, from psychology research, there have been some really interesting experiments about swearing as an analgesic and as a way to combat pain. And there's an example in the book about a psychologist who watched his wife go through labour and swear consistently, and he was a bit like, this is a bit weird, what's happening? He talked to the midwife and said, does this normally happen? You know, what's happening? And it's really common, very normal for women to swear during labour. Really hurts, you know, this is an acceptable thing. And he got really interested in this and did some experiments with people where he got them to put hands in freezing cold water and then had a control group. One group swore, the other group didn't. The group that swore were able to hold their hands in water much, much longer than the group that didn't. And he also did it on exercise bikes as well. And the group that swore went faster and could stay on for longer as an endurance test as well. So there are values out there to this.
What about the sort of belief, though, that if you encounter somebody who, you know, uses the F word about every third word, for example, you sort of, or I'll speak for myself, I sort of make the assumption, well, they can't be very educated, I've got a limited vocabulary, and that's why they're doing this. Is that a fair judgment?
The vocabulary argument isn't borne out by the research, but in that particular context, that person isn't acting appropriately for that particular context because you're not showing that you're doing it as well. So it's not something that's establishing.
We're not bonding.
You know, there's no bonding going on there. That person's actually being offensive, and that, you know, that does happen. I think we've all been in situations where we've been on trains or somebody's really, you know, just think, oh, just stop. You know, this is too much. It's gone too far. If it's every other word. But the intelligence argument is really interesting. And again, there's been a lot of linguistic studies on this. And the evidence actually shows that the most intelligent people swear as well. It's not something that's just a working class thing that, you know, that working class people will do. Middle class, upper class people swear as much, you know, sometimes more than, you know, the stereotype of the, you know, the working class loud. It is a stereotype, it really, really is. And if you think of some of the things that have gone into social media around Boris Johnson and when things have made it into the public light, you know, it's quite common to have, you know, the F word spoken very, very frequently at very senior levels of the cabinet, but it's behind closed doors. And when politicians are caught with their microphones still switched on and they swear, that's when the boundaries, you really see it.
And you include in the book probably the most famous example of that, and it's obviously highly topical given that we're now in an election campaign, the Gordon Brown bigot incident in the 2010, I think it was, wasn't it, the general election. So and you talk about front stage and back of stage behaviour. So just tell us what that particular incident, the Gordon Brown incident.
This is the front stage and backstage is from sociology from the 1960s, and it's a brilliant way of describing the importance of context. So if you can remember the incident, Gordon Brown was out on the street. He was very, very polite to Gillian Duffy, the woman he was talking to, who was a Labour voter that had become disenfranchised with the Labour Party. So he was doing his best to talk around, and he was talking about all of his policies. And then if you remember, he went into the car and he'd still got his microphone on from Sky News. And he got in the car, got done all of the, oh, it's so lovely to meet you, so great, bye everyone, got in the car and went, ugh, that was ridiculous, was the first thing he said. And his communications person was with him, went, why, what's the matter? Oh, that woman, who put me with that woman? And went off. And of course, there was a moral decision that was made when he called her, well, what was the matter? You know, and he said, oh, she's just bigoted. And she'd made a comment, you know, which to all intents and purposes was bigoted, you know, about people from Eastern Europe, and she'd used the word flocking, which again in linguistic circles is really heavily associated with very pejorative, metaphorical ways of describing groups of people. And it was that he was reacting to. But then of course, because you've got that microphone still on, the journalist at the time made the decision to make that public, and you know, said she said that she felt the hand of history on her shoulders, and she had no choice, she had no alternative but to put it in the public domain. So that completely changed his schedule, arguably changed the course of the election somewhat. You know, it was a really big story at the time. Gordon Brown then had to go on 5 Live and was asked about it. He ended up then, if you remember, driving and apologising to her, so he had to do a public
cup of tea in her front room.
Yeah, and then he came out and he said, Gillian and I have been talking, and used her first name, saying, we're really good friends now, and it was just a misunderstanding, it was just a miscommunication, and we've cleared it up. hoping that that would be the end of it all. But even 10 years on, it was still being reported in the newspapers, the Duffy incident, and occasionally she's interviewed, isn't she, about it?
It raises the question, doesn't it? I mean, literally in the last week, when in the first TV debate, which probably many of you will have seen, the Starmer-Sunak debate, and Rishi Sunak mentioned this £2,000 tax claim thing, I think 5 or 6 times before Keir Starmer responded in any way. And one of the explanations I saw in one newspaper was that, you know, Keir Starmer is naturally a very polite person and didn't want to be seen to sort of break the rules of the debate, blah, blah, blah. So, I mean, does politeness have any part, do you think, to play in political campaigns? Or is it, you know, all's fair in love and war, and if somebody wants to be aggressive and talk over other people, you know, in order to win an election or try and win, you know, that's acceptable, arguably. Yeah.
It's an interesting one, this, because the norms of the House of Commons are very adversarial. And it's set up in a way that you challenge people, you know, there are the rules of turn taking that are quite stringent that come in, but some of the language that's used in that particular political setting is impolite. But then some researchers have argued, but is it really impolite? Because it is expected in that context. You know that that's the norm, and you expect politicians to be aggressive towards one another and to be adversarial and to challenge. I think when it gets to a point where it becomes too much is the interruptions and when you can't have your say. And I think a lot of the press the next day after that particular debate, after the first one, said it was just two men who don't like each other, going at each other, shouting at each other. This isn't in the public interest to have it in this way. So in a way, it's the kind of the impoliteness that's being played out there, that they didn't have that level of respect for one another, or they weren't willing to give each other the floor. And that can go one of two ways with voters. It can really turn voters off. It can really, you think, oh, I'm not watching this. You know, this is typical politicians, and it can turn people off voting as well. So it can be quite damaging.
And curiously, this is just my opinion, some of you may have seen the one on, was it Friday night, and where Angela Rayner and Penny Mordaunt were going at each other, and they happened to be, by the way the lots are drawn, they happened to be standing next to each other, so they were, you know, as close as you and I are. But somehow that one to me seemed a bit more respectful. I mean, they were clearly not agreeing. Their world views are quite different. But somehow it felt less sort of.
It's interesting, isn't it?
I don't know. That may just be maybe I'm expecting. Maybe it's because they're worried.
It could be those kind of expectations. It really could be.
I don't know. But of course, just finally on the politics thing, you talk about the House of Commons. Although yes, it's sort of part of the ritual of the House of Commons that people are sort of shouting at each other and all of that, and all the baying in the background and all of that, which would be considered unbelievably rude in different contexts, wouldn't it? People sort of, whoa, going on in the background of the conversation. If somebody calls somebody a liar in the context of the House of Commons, that's like a capital offence, isn't it?
Which is,
it's very curious, isn't it? Really?
Those rules that are there are really interesting.
Right, we've a few minutes left before we throw it open to questions. Just two other things I'd like to touch on, really. You spend quite a bit of time in the book talking about sport and the rules of sport and the etiquette of sport, which is really interesting. And including particularly, I found interesting martial arts, which I suppose you might think of as being quite a sort of, violent physical encounter. So just say a bit about, what, in a sense, sport teaches us about politeness.
The martial arts example is an interesting one because it's in martial arts, etiquette and politeness are very deeply ingrained. So we might think about it, like you say, all being about combat and fighting. I practice martial arts myself, and part of that, I teach it as well to young children, and part of that is about teaching in this context, you behave in this way. These are the rules, this is what you do. And that respect for your partner and bowing, making sure that you respond in a certain way to your instructor, you don't question. It's very, very traditional. And it goes back centuries, and having that tradition in a sport like that is something that makes the practice more authentic, or something that you kind of really feel like you're part of something that's much bigger and has a real strong sense of history. And you're also enacting the norms of another culture as well, so you have to kind of create that cultural space within those particular environments. And then the book talks a lot about team sports, so football, rugby, some quite high profile. teams are discussed, and broadcast interviews as well, and what managers do, what players do when things have gone wrong, for example, and how do people deal with that under the spotlight of the media. And it looks at, kind of examples of managers who are really successful but deal very politely, and then managers like Jose Mourinho is in the book, who are very, very impolite and will acknowledge the fact that they are rude and they are impolite, and that's part of their personality, and that's the way they are, very, very aggressive in interviews and will challenge the interviewer, versus people that are good sports and want to come across as good sports and want to come across as respectful to others, and would never dream of criticising their team members or their players in those particular arenas.
And you talk about the campaign which the Football Association has had, hasn't it? Respect campaign,
that's right,
which is really about, isn't it, trying to do something about, particularly in grassroots football, the abuse of referees, like parents on the touchline of kids' football matches, swearing at the referees and all of that. Has that worked?
Well, as somebody that stands at the side of a football pitch every Sunday watching my son play football, no. It's the short answer. But what happens now, I don't know if anybody else has experienced this, but when, as a parent signing up, you have to sign a pledge that you will abide by the respect charter, and that you will, if somebody, one of the other parents or somebody is shouting inappropriately on the touchline, that you will intervene and you will say something. It depends who it is and whether you feel physically threatened. But there's that idea that we have that responsibility to one another to call people out, particularly if the children or the referee, whoever it is being shouted at. And I think it's helped raise the profile of it, and it's helped. I have seen some people intervene, and and it's worked on some occasions, and other occasions it hasn't worked at all. It's the same, let's say, for if anybody goes to professional football matches, it's very, very different to what it was 20 years ago. On the seats, I'm an Aston Villa fan for my sins, I'm sorry to admit that in Yorkshire, but it's true. And there's a little label on the seats now in front with a number where you can report abuse. That would never have happened 20 years ago. So that has permeated its way into the sport.
But you still get it's hardly surprising that young kids may verbally abuse referees when they see, the managers of professional Premiership teams criticising the referees on TV.
Exactly. It establishes it as a norm, doesn't it?
Behaviour norm at the top.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, like diving and some of those things that are really, inappropriate, you wouldn't ideally want happening in a sports world. When you've got the professionals doing it in such a public sphere and have so much kudos and status in society, it's inevitable that children are going to copy that.
Okay, last question from me, which is, you talk about this in the book as well, how you say sorry. So we all make mistakes, don't we? We all, are rude to other people at one time or another. I think it's fair to say the Prime Minister made a mistake, which he felt he needed to apologise this week. Apology. So, how do you do a good apology?
A good apology, there's a 10-step guide in the book to giving a good apology. Make sure that you're the right person to apologise for. To give the apology in the first place is really, really important. So if you're the CEO of a big company and something catastrophic has happened, don't send somebody junior out to the media and throw them to the lions. That happens quite a lot, and there are always repercussions of that. Make sure you take responsibility. So a really bad way to apologise is to say, I'm sorry if I caused offence. The use of the if, that conditional there comes in. That's not sincere. That's not a way of saying it. And how you say it as well. This is, again, thinking back to children, is say sorry. Sorry! You've got to say sorry like you mean it. So the pitch and the tone, my son's terrible at this. Say sorry to your sister. Sorry, it's like, no, not like that. And he's like, but I've done what you asked me to do. It's like, no, you've got to learn how to say it properly. So that sincerity is really important. You might get, say, for example, politicians apologising for something historical, and it is their role to do it because they are the current leader of the country.
Slavery from hundreds of years ago.
Yeah, exactly. And it's your role to do that. So again, it's got to be, the head of state or the person that's in charge. There's an example in the book about Justin Trudeau, Canadian Prime Minister, and there was a time when the media is saying he apologises too much. He's apologising for everything. This makes the apology not meaningful anymore. So don't over-apologise, particularly as a public figure. And that's kind of what happened. I mean, that Partygate is in the apologies chapter, and we've got all of the different iterations of Boris Johnson's various apologies. And when he was actually taken out of office and taken down by his own government, it got to the stage where it was almost like, I'm just going to apologise for the fact that one of my ministers, you know, has been sexually harassing people. And I think it got to that point where it's like, you can't keep doing this, you can't keep apologising and say it's fine now. It kind of got to a tipping point because it was happening all the time. And it just was at such a, you know, such a stage, there were so many lies in the earlier apologies, that the apology after apology after apology, it became insincere. You can't do that. So being genuinely sorry and authentically sorry is very, very important when you're apologising as well.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose another recent example, obviously we had the example literally the last few days, Prime Minister trying to say sorry for the D-Day thing, and we had Paula Venables at the, you know, agonisingly over 3 days, sort of saying sorry. We'll have our different views about whether she sounded genuine or not, but that's another matter. Right, okay, thank you very much. I'm sure there will be some questions and observations that people may have. We do have a microphone here, just to make sure everybody can hear everything. So who would like to kick us off? Yeah, our friend in the blue at the back there. Just wait for the microphone, that'd be great.
I was just thinking about the role that you think accent is portraying now, and whether it's as it was, whether it's as important. I always felt like a bias being northern, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. It's a really interesting question. I've got one of my friends is in the audience who's a lecturer in accent and dialect. You should probably answer this one, Carla, but I'll do it. So, if you think about call centres and locations of call centres in the northeast or Scotland, the accent is chosen because of trustworthiness, you know, because it's a nice kind of accent. There are tests done called Match Guys tests, where people are given different accents to listen to, and then you rank them in terms of trustworthiness, in terms of whether you will believe somebody if they were in court. Birmingham comes out very badly in all of this. In every category, you know, Birmingham's always at the bottom of the list, you know, which is my hometown. Liverpool, the association with crime, you know, and they're stereotypes, but they're incredibly powerful stereotypes. And that kind of northern trustworthiness, you know, is that one of the reasons why call centres are based in certain locations? So accent does play quite a significant role as well in that, and it's connected to how we view one another socially as that kind of broader part of
I
things.
think it's quite interesting on accent as well, that it's still regarded as an acceptable form of, in comedy terms, isn't it? You know, you will get things in comedy acts that are making fun of, say, the Birmingham accent, or you know, portraying all Cockneys as being white boys, you know, that sort of thing. Whereas, you know, other characteristics of people might have the colour of their skin, or whether they're a man or a woman, of course, is legally protected in a sense. And I know comedians do still make jokes about those things, but they're much more careful, aren't they, around that. And it's interesting how accent and regional characteristics are sort of still regarded as fair game.
Absolutely.
Interesting. Okay, we're getting. I'll tell you what. Say, why don't we go to our friend here, but then I will come to you next. Yeah.
I was obviously wondering because a lot of politeness involves a lot of closer, because of a lot of politeness involves a lot of subtext. I was wondering if how autism or kind of neurodivergency in general would impact the way that it's perceived.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's an area that I haven't researched myself, but I've had multiple conversations with other people, and things like eye gaze and that kind of thing, which is an established norm, can be really, really difficult for neurodivergent people, and is often perceived as rudeness or inappropriateness. And it's a whole range of different characteristics that people's behaviours don't fit that social norm, and it does result in very negative evaluation and very negative associations, and it is quite marked and quite stigmatised. So I think we're in a position now where it's talked about much more broadly in society now than it probably ever has been before, and there are training courses coming into businesses, you know, that we work with. Universities have training around precisely these issues, and consciousness raising that just because somebody doesn't fit the norm in this particular instance doesn't mean that they're intending to be inappropriate or challenging or impolite. And it's really broadening that net of what politeness means for different people and how different people act with politeness. So it is mentioned in that.
Thank you. yeah, let's pass it along. Okay.
Thank you. A brief comment and then a quick question. I am a grassroots football referee, and I think respect has made a difference. Having said that, I've had to make 4 reports this year about poor behaviour by officials and spectators. But the thing is, they do go to the FA.
Yeah.
There are sanctions, so it is improving. I think that's good. The question is there a line to be drawn between politeness and showing consideration? So I'm thinking of, say, physical manifestations, say helping building design for people with visual impairment. Is that consideration or is it being polite?
That's a really interesting one, because it's part of changing social norms, isn't it? And it's part of building in a broader spectrum. So I think in terms of politeness, or in terms of what that looks like, that's more consideration, I would say, but it's part of that broader sense that your needs are being taken care of and that you're being looked after. So by showing the fact, say, for example, that you've got disabled access to buildings, that kind of thing, is that kind of what you mean? Or
yes,
yeah,
yes.
Then that shows that your views have been taken into account, or that it's not just built for one particular person or one particular type of people. So from that perspective, it's quite difficult to draw a boundary, because it is quite fuzzy between, it's similar in a way to what we were talking about with the neurodiversity as well. It's showing the fact that different people matter in different manifestations and in different ways. So you could articulate that it is part of that broader, if we think about politeness as harmony and success and having good relationships, it's part of that picture, isn't it? It's part of how it's viewed. And I know at our own university, where we've had a couple of issues with disabled access, it is part, if you're not included and you can't get into a building, it feels extremely exclusionary, and it feels like this is not for me. It feels rude and it feels like exclusion. So I think from that particular instance, it is politeness, or it's impoliteness if you haven't thought about it.
Isn't
Definitely.
there something inherent in the concept of politeness about a willingness to be respectful of other people with whom you may well disagree, or with who you may really not like?
Yeah.
There is something. It's almost saying, okay, I don't agree with this person, that obviously in the political context that's relevant, or I really don't like this person, but actually sort of society, quite rightly, is demanding that we should do our best to try and, not shout at people and not be nasty to them.
It depends what you want in that relationship ultimately, because I think we all know situations where, say, you had a friend and they're an ex-friend, and there's a reason why they're an ex-friend, is because you've got to a point where you're like, actually, I'm not going to be spoken to like that anymore, and I'm going to call you out on this, and I don't agree with that. It depends how much you value that, and it also depends on whether you say they might be your boss, and you might not want to lose your job. So in that sense, we go along with a lot of things, don't we?
Politeness can be a disguise for actually avoiding discussing difficult stuff, I suppose, as well.
Yeah, think about topics that are taboo, you might not want to talk about in a certain situation.
Right. We can pass the mic back in that direction and up one. That would be great. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you, great talk. Just very quickly, they say that offence is taken and not given, and it's easier to wear slippers and carpet the earth. So if someone is being impolite, should we just suck it up and toughen up, or should we address it, and if so, how?
That's a great question. It reminds me of an instance in the book where a traffic warden is talking to a member of the public. The member of the public has been given a ticket, and the traffic warden, he approaches the traffic warden and says, I was only 10 minutes, and the traffic warden tells him to F off, and says, you F off, and the traffic warden gets really aggressive, and the member of the public videos him. And again, this is something that you couldn't do 20 years ago. The video goes viral, the traffic warden loses his job, and the council have to come out and say, we're terribly sorry, our employees shouldn't act in this way, they're not trained like this, his behaviour was really inappropriate. So by putting something on social media, that's then resulted, in that person, who's holding office for a council, behaving very inappropriate at the workplace, got called out in a very indirect way by that video going viral, and that is the way that it can manifest itself sometimes. So again, it depends on context, and I think that if people are being impolite, say in the workplace, then there is a tendency, I think, for us to go, I want to do something about this because I don't want this happening to other people. I don't want that experience to happen. And if you hold public office, then you have that kind of responsibility, regardless of where you are, that you think, actually, that is going to be called out. Again, it comes back to that relationship that you want to have with people going forward, but I think there is a sense that if somebody's been really rude and been really impolite and you want to call them out, they're not going to punch you or hit you, in retaliation. You've got to assess what's going on around and what their reaction is likely to be, and that's one of the reasons why I think it's quite difficult to do it at football games and that kind of thing. You've got to think about your own safety. So if you're likely to get punched in the face because you've called somebody out, you're probably not going to want to do it. But I think there is a certain set, and it comes back to the football example as well, calling other people out where they're being rude, I think is something really important and something that we should do. But assess your safety first. Please don't take that advice and then get punched.
We've probably got time for 2 more questions. Yeah, if we could bring the mic over here, please. Sorry.
Oh.
Sorry. Right, so let's
Thank you. Have you got advice for people setting up political debates, like leadership debates? Are there things that you can do physically to set the context that will reduce the likelihood of what we saw the other day? Like, for example, sitting down, does that help?
Yeah.
Or facing each other versus sitting alongside?
Yeah.
And where should the presenter, the moderator, be? Does it help to be female? It's clearly not sufficient.
Some colleagues have done work on I think it was the 2015 election debate, looking at these kind of things. And there was a moment when Nicola Sturgeon, the leader of Plaid Cymru, and might have even been Theresa May at that time. But it was after Brexit, the election after Brexit, and they hugged on stage on the platform. And this was really unusual, and the media went crazy. And it's like, did you see them hug each other? It was really, very different as a form of political debate. And that was one where they were standing up and they were behind podiums and being quite strategically positioned. And it was when Ed Miliband was the leader of the Labour Party, and there were photographs of him just looking all sad off by himself and the women all hugging each other. And that was made possible, by the space and the fact that they decided to do that at the end of the debate. Sitting down, definitely, I think, makes a difference.
That's a really good point.
It's excellent.
If you're sitting down, I think you're probably slightly more relaxed.
And you're less likely to make the point. Body language is, you're kind of sitting down, you are more relaxed. It's a really good point. It would be interesting to put it to the test.
After the debate on Friday, I think I'm right in saying, so Angela Rayner and Penny Morgan were shaking hands and, sort of doing this, and the others. I don't think anybody shook hands with Nigel Farage. He was at the other end.
All by himself.
Anyway, right, we're sort of running out of time, but we are going to have a question from our friend here who's been waiting patiently. Sorry, I didn't spot you earlier.
That's lovely. I'm a trustee with the York LGBT Forum, and trans pronouns and trans huge thorny debates going on right, left and centre with feminism, etc. This is a hugely potential to be impolite and lacking in respect and not understanding where other people are coming from at all. Have you looked into this, and is there anybody taking just a standing back research kind of ground into how we can improve relationships between people who feel that other people are not normal human beings, and just let's get on with it?
I talk about dead naming in the book. There's a chapter on terms of address and about how, say, actors or people in public life who wanted to change their names have been now able to do that and go back historically. So, and then about how the term dead name came into the language, and it was first mentioned on Twitter in 2011, 2012, and how that's then permeated its way into our everyday discourse. With the debates, and you're absolutely right, some of them are really awful. There's really bad decision making that's going on, and really vociferous discussions that don't show that respect and they don't have those principles. So if you compare it to, say, like a business meeting, you have different sides arguing, the inability to see each other's perspective is very, very clear in that space, and it's hugely adversarial on social media, but also in face-to-face encounters as well. So thinking more about how do you kind of bring politeness to the table or establish some norms of how the debates go on, I think would be really, really important. And it picks up again on the kind of the political debates as well, doesn't it? Those kind of, how do you have a good political debate? How do you have a debate that doesn't degenerate into a slanging match and people not understanding one another? You need a kind of basic set of principles and respect laid as a foundation stone that you can then move forward on. It's really important.
Okay, thank you very much. I think it is 2 o'clock, so I'm afraid I have to be direct and say we're going to finish. And the one thing that we haven't talked about at all hardly that is in the book is how behaviour in cyberspace or on the internet has affected politeness. And it's a whole other subject, but Louise does deal with that in the book as well. If you're interested in getting a copy and even, I'm sure, getting Louise to sign it and have a chat with you, you'll be outside with our friends from Fox Lane Books who have 1 or 2 copies. Thank you so much for coming. I hope you found it interesting and illuminating, and thank you for your questions. Please do support other events in the remaining week almost of this festival. There are plenty of them, and they're all free. I think I might be saying they're still all free. Yeah. So please have a look at the programme if you haven't done so already, and do try and get to some other events. But can we just show our appreciation for Louise?